Chapter 3 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. The origin of the melodies of the chorales. Luther acted with regard to the melodies on the same principles as he had done with regard to the text. He took whatever old melody suited his purpose and improved it, only the improvement was often more drastic in the case of the tune than in that of the words, for it was his first care to see that the melodies were singable and easily grasped. In 1524, the crucial year for German church music, Konrad Rupf and Johann Walter, two eminent musicians, were for 3 weeks Luther's guests, acting as his house presentary, Kantorei im Hause. Kostlin, who in his essay on Luther als Vervater der evangelischen Kirchengesanges depicts the trio at their work. While Walter and Rupf sat at the table, bending over the music sheets with pen in hand, Father Luther walked up and down the room, trying on the fife the tunes that poured from his memory and his imagination to ally themselves with the poems he had discovered, until he had made the verse melody a rhythmically finished, well-rounded, strong and compact whole. Thus the sacred songs of the Middle Ages preserved their own melodies, and the Latin hymns were translated in such a way that the new words fitted the old melodies, just as in the Enchiridion of 1524. Often, indeed, the poem was so constructed as to fit the tone of some sacred song that was already well known. Since we rarely know the history of a melody before it became attached to a hymn, the name of which it henceforth bears, it is difficult to decide which melodies were adopted and which composed by the musicians of the Reformation. In any case, we must not underestimate the number of the latter. Johann Walter, in particular, seems to have employed a rich inventive gift in the service of religion. To what extent Luther himself was a composer of melodies cannot be determined. Contemporary testimonies, on the strength of which a number of tunes are attributed to him, are much too vague to prove anything positively. The melody of Ein fester Burg, that may with certainty be attributed to him, is woven out of Gregorian reminiscences. The recognition of this fact deprives the melody of none of its beauty, and Luther of none of the credit for it. It really takes considerable talent to create an organic unity out of fragments. In his melody to the German Gloria, Allein Gott in der Höhe sei Nicolaus Decius openly makes use of the Et in terra pax from the Gloria Paschalis. There was nothing strange in this to the men who had been brought up in the singing schools of the Catholic Church. It would indeed be surprising if they had thought it so. We may recall the fact that the medieval hymn in its turn derives from the Gregorian use. Nikolaus Hermann, cantor of Joachimsthal in Bohemia, who was both poet and musician, wrote some very good chorale melodies. To him we owe Lobt Gott ihr Christen allzugleich and Erscheinen ist der ehrlich Tag. On the whole, the number of musicians who wrote melodies for the church was not large, not because at that time there were no musicians capable of the work, but rather because their services were not called for. For a new melody to become a true folk melody, of the kind that would gain immediate acceptance everywhere, was a difficult process, requiring a long period of time. It was much more natural to impress existing melodies into the service of the church, sacred melodies at first, and then, when these did not suffice, secular ones. The Reformed Church made the most abundant use of this latter source. Among the church tunes there are a few indigenous melodies, as there are among those of the people. All have had an external origin. The learned Auguste Gevaert had expressed the opinion that the oldest Catholic church music was transplanted into the church from the pagan streets. For the Reformation it was a question of much more than acquiring serviceable melodies. While it brought the folk song into religion, it wished to elevate secular art in general. That the object was conversion rather than simple borrowing is shewn by the title of a collection that appeared in Frankfurt in 1571. Gassenhauer, Reuter und Bergliedlein christlich, moraliter and sittlich verandert, damit die Bose und Agerliche, Weise, Unnütze und Schampare, Liedlein auf Gassen, Feldern und in Hausern zu singen mit der Zeit abschen mochte, wenn man geistige gute Nutze Texte unter Worte darunter haben mochte. Street songs, cavalier songs, mountain songs, transformed into Christian and moral songs, for the abolishing in course of time of the bad and vexatious practice of singing idle and shameful songs in the streets, in fields, and at home, by substituting for them good, sacred, honest words. Believing, as he said, that the devil does not need all the good tunes for himself, Luther formed his Christmas hymn, Vom Himmel hoch da komm ich her, out of the melody of the riddle song, Ich komm aus fremden Landen her, in which the singer propounds a riddle and takes her garland from the maiden which cannot solve it. Afterwards, however, he had to let the devil have the melody back again, for even after its conversion it haunted every dancing place and every tavern. In 1551, Walther ejected it from the hymn book, replacing it by the tune to which Luther's Christmas hymn is sung to this day. Reversions of this kind, however, were the exception. The majority of the melodies that were dignified by admission into the church were able to maintain themselves in their new station, and may justly feel aggrieved that in all these centuries the tooth of time has not been able to make away with the scanty documentary evidence of their secular origin. It would have been difficult to detect the secular element in them, for age confers on all music a dignity that gives it a touch of religious elevation. A mystic bond embraces and unites antiquity and religion. One clever writer maintains, not without reason, that we could mislead all the purists of church music by putting before them an old secular motet with an accompanying sacred text. To give a few examples, Heinrich Isaak's melody to Innsbruck Ich muss dich lassen became the chorale O Welt ich muss dich lassen, and the foot soldiers' song at the Battle of Pavia, the Pavia tone, became the chorale Durch Adams Fall ist ganz verderbt. Bach 5, number 13. The chorale melody Von Gott will ich nicht lassen, Bach 7, number 56, is derived from the love song Einmal tat ich spazieren. The chorale Ich hab mein Sach Gott heimgestellt, Bach 6, number 28, borrowed its melody from another love song, Es gibt auf Erd kein schwerer Lied. The melody Helft mir Gottes gut preisen, Bach 5, number 21, had been one of the table songs, 1572, of Joachim Magdeburg. In 1601, Hans Leo Hassler, 1564–1612, published at Nuremberg a Lustgarten neue Tosche Gesange, Paetti, Galliarden und Intraden mit wir 5 und 8 Stimmen, Pleasure Garden of New German Songs, balletti, gaillards, and intrades, for 4, 5, and 8 voices. 12 years later, one of these melodies, the love song, Mein Gemüst ist mir verwirret von einer Jungfrau zart, appeared as a chorale tune to the funerary hymn, Herzlich tut mich verlangen, Bach 5, number 27, while at a later date, allied with Paul Gerhardt's poem, O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden, it became the most important melody of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Any foreign melody that had charm and beauty was stopped at the frontier and pressed into the service of the evangelical service. This was the lot of the melody of In dir ist Freude, Bach 5, number 34, which came from Italy in 1591 with the balletti of Giovanni Gastoldi. So again with the little French song Il me suffit de tous mes mots, which appeared in 1529 among the 34 chansons musicales of the celebrated Parisian music engraver Pierre Attagnon. It was utilized for the hymn Was mein Gott will, das geschieht allzeit. One wonders if Bach had any suspicion of this fact when he harmonized the splendid melody for the St. Matthew Passion. Other French folk tunes came at a later date to the German chorale by way of the Huguenot Psalter. As the Calvinist Church found no sacred folk songs already in existence, it was compelled to borrow even more largely than the German Church. Audouin has shown in his interesting work on the Clément Marot et le Psautier Huguenot the process by which the melodies were compiled for the Psalter. Even Calvin had to laugh, for the only time in his life when he saw the most frivolous tunes walking along chastely and devoutly hand in hand with the lofty poems of David and Solomon. The Huguenot Psalter appeared in its definitive form in 1562. As early as 1565, Ambrosius Lobwasser, professor of law in Königsberg, published a German version of the Psalms, adapting them to the 125 melodies of the French work. These tunes thus became known and were at once incorporated in the German chorale books. The splendid melody of Wenn wir in höchsten Noten sind, Bach 7, number 58, comes from the Huguenot Psalter. It was probably a French folk song originally. Only the shameless curiosity that characterizes our boasted historical sense can rejoice at these discoveries. The musician does not trouble himself about them, and forgets them as soon as they are told to him, for they tell him no more than what he already knew by instinct, that all true and deeply felt music, whether secular or sacred, has its home on the heights where art and religion dwell. Happy are the chorales whose origin nothing is known. This was the good fortune of the melodies to Nikolai Wie schon leuchtet der Morgenstern and Wachet auf ruft uns die Stimme, Bach 7, number 57. Both songs appear for the first time in 1598 in the appendix to a treatise on the glories of the future life. When the treasures of melody to be drawn upon were at last exhausted, there came the epoch of the composer. The copious spiritual poetry of the 17th century called them to work. There was scarcely an evangelical musician of that time who did not compose melodies for the church. Almost all the masters whose names adorn the history of polyphonic chorale music call for mention also in the history of the origin of the chorale melodies. And it was with the melodies as with the poems, while a great many of a composer's tunes were destined to perish, he managed to breathe the breath of eternal life into a few of them, or at any rate into one, which will shine in imperishable beauty in our hymn books as long as the evangelical hymn exists. The most notable of these writers is Johann Krüger, 1598 to 1662, of St. Nicholas's Church in Berlin, who devoted his art to the poems of Paul Gerhardt and Johann Franck. The most beautiful of his melodies, such as Jesu meine Freude, Schmucke dich, o liebe Seele, Nun danket alle Gott, occupy a place of honor in Bach's work. The very first chorale in the St. Matthew Passion, Herzliebster Jesu, is by Krüger. The spirit, however, which dominated music about the beginning of the 18th century made it incapable of developing the true church tune any further. German music got out of touch with German song and fell further and further under the influence of the more artistic Italian melody. It could no longer achieve that naivete which, ever since the Middle Ages, had endowed it with those splendid, unique tunes. Moreover, the secular music that was then flourishing in the towns and at the courts lured it onto new problems, and it could no longer find its sole satisfaction in a self-denying cooperation with religious poetry. When Bach came on the scene, the great epoch of chorale creation was at an end, like that of the sacred poem. Sacred melodies were indeed still written, but they were songs of the aria type, not true congregational hymns. An indefinable air of subjectivity pervaded them. In this matter Bach too was subject to the laws of his epoch. When in 1736 Schemelli, cantor at the castle of Zeitz, published through Breitkopf a large hymn book containing 954 numbers, he approached the famous cantor of St. Thomas's Church to beg his cooperation. Bach undertook, we are told in the preface to the book, not only to revise the figured basses, but to compose melodies for the hymns that lacked them. Since in this hymn book, as in the others, the names of the composers are not given, we cannot be perfectly sure which or how many tunes are by Bach. Those, however, which we can ascribe to him with some certainty, since they cannot be traced to an earlier date, are rather sacred arias than chorales. This description applies, however, only to their character, not their beauty, for their peculiar loveliness comes from the fact that they are the work of an artist brought up on the German chorale, writing under the influence of the formerly perfect Italian melodic form. Any one who has been thrilled by the strains of Komm süßer Tod or Liebster Herr Jesu knows how unspeakably grand these melodies are. We must not attempt, however, to sing them as congregational songs, or to arrange them for four voices, for then they wither at once like the water lily that has been torn from its home. The heaviness and dullness that settles on them nowadays, when they are treated as chorales, show clearly that they are not true chorales. After Bach, the bonds between the chorales and the sacred song are completely broken. The melodies that Emanuel Bach, Johann Joachim Quantz, Johann Adam Hiller, and Beethoven wrote, in artistic rivalry to Gellert's poems, only show what a distance separated them all from the chorale. In the epoch of rationalism, it is true, the melodies were not diluted to the same extent as the text, but there was still a hard struggle until the old melodies were again rehabilitated everywhere, and were no longer jostled in the chorale books by the characterless tunes of the later epoch. Now that this has been achieved, the dispute today is as to whether we shall retain the old chorales with the uniform note values in which we have received them from the 18th century, or whether we should restore to them their original rhythmic variety. A definite decision indeed is hardly possible. Each pro that can be adduced from historical, artistic, or practical considerations is at once opposed by a contra of equal force in its way. Bach is concerned with this controversy to the extent that those who advocate the uniform, polished form of chorales can plead that, although the opposite tradition had a powerful following all around him, he felt no artistic compulsion to revert to the old rhythmic form of the chorale, and so there is no cogent objection from the purely musical point of view against the chorale as we have received it from his hands. Again, the enthusiasts for the rhythmic melodies the old master can plead as St. Paul once did against the Corinthians, who knew all things so much better, that he too thinks he is possessed by the Spirit. Here are the three typical forms of Ein fester Bürg. 1. Original form of Luther's chorale. 2. Luther's chorale in a hymn book of 1570. 3. Luther's chorale in the form used by Bach. End of chapter 3. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.